"Get up, Boone. Get up or die, right there." That was what I told myself while I lay face down in the mud, my ears still ringing from the sound of the tree coming down like a cannon blast. I forced myself up, gripped the handle of my axe, and saw it, a rock about the size of a basketball cutting through the rain and smashing straight into the windshield of the crew truck. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a rock slide. A family of massive Bigfoots was throwing rocks at us again and again, deliberately, carefully, with purpose. After 30 years running saws in the woods, I never thought I'd have to relearn what the word predator meant. The Olympic Mountains of Washington hold old-growth cedar forests so steep and remote that some places can only be reached by a helicopter because there's simply no practical way to build a road into them. And maybe that was exactly why one Sasquatch family had chosen that country as its last refuge. Welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. As always, this story has been assembled from several different sources, and I invite you to listen with an open mind. If stories like this satisfy your curiosity about the Bigfoot, subscribe to the channel before we go back to that morning when Boone Hartley was still marking the final cut on the largest cedar he had ever seen. Rain had soaked through Boone Hartley's shoulders more than an hour before he realized he couldn't feel the cold anymore. Work long enough in the Olympic forests in November, and your body either learned to tolerate it or convinced you to find another line of work. Boone had stayed for more than 30 years, and that morning, at 58, he stood on a mountainside so steep that every step required finding solid footing before putting his weight down. In front of him was the largest cedar his crew had been assigned to bring down that season. The trunk measured more than 13 feet across, the base flared outward like a small room, and the silver-gray bark peeled away in long strips beneath the rain. Looking up from the base, the trunk disappeared into fog before emerging again higher above, forcing Wyatt Combs to keep leaning back just to see the crown. Boone had started calling the tree the king when the crew arrived 3 days earlier. He wasn't someone who usually named trees. Almost never. But some trees had been standing so long that a man felt like he was entering their territory, not the other way around. Tripod Doyle knelt beside the western cut, both hands controlling the long saw with his usual irritated expression. People had started calling him Tripod years earlier after an accident left his left knee stiffer than the right, but on a mountainside, he still had better balance than most men half his age. The engine roared steadily, spraying orange cedar sawdust around his boots before the rain quickly turned it into paste. 2 chasers handled the lines, cleared branches, and checked the escape route. Wyatt, who had been on the job only 3 months, kept looking at his watch every few minutes. Boone noticed but didn't say anything at first. Young men often thought the job ended when the saw finished cutting through the last fibers. Men who survived long enough in logging learned that the most dangerous moment often began exactly when they thought the work was finished. "You waiting on a date or waiting on the tree to fall?" Boone asked without looking at Wyatt. Wyatt gave an embarrassed laugh and pulled his gloves higher over his wrists. "I was just thinking, if we finish this one before 3, we can still make it down to the landing before dark. If you want to get down fast, you'd better slow down." Wyatt looked at the slope below them. The planned fall line had been cleared into a broad corridor running at an angle along the ridge. If everything went according to plan, the king would fall along the slope, its crown pushing through a strip of younger trees before the trunk landed on ground soft enough to keep the log from breaking apart. Wyatt asked why they didn't simply drop it straight downhill and let gravity do the rest. Boone pointed down the valley with the head of his axe. "Because this tree isn't firewood. If it takes off straight down there, it'll bounce on the rocks, twist and split into 3 or 4 sections. The company loses a pile of money, and we spend another week cleaning up the mess." He didn't mention a number. Wyatt was already obsessed enough with production targets After all the calls from Cascadia Timber pushing the crew to move faster, there was no reason to help the kid turn every tree into an invoice. After nearly 3 hours, the cuts on both sides had gone deep into the trunk. Tripod shut down the saw, pulled his ear protection away, and cursed the rain using exactly the same words he had used all morning. Boone walked around the base, checking the cuts, the steel wedges, and the wooden hinge they had intentionally left to control the direction of the fall. Something made him slow down. He placed his palm against the wet bark. It wasn't anything he could write in a report. The tree wasn't vibrating strangely. There was no clear cracking sound. But what traveled through his arm didn't feel like what he expected from a healthy cedar. The surface felt hard and cold, with almost no response when Tripod struck the opposite side with the head of a sledge. Boone tilted his head and listened. The sound was duller than it should have been. Tripod looked at him. "You listening to the tree talk again?" "Maybe. What's it saying? Telling you to shut up so I can hear." Tripod laughed, but Boone didn't. He crouched and studied the sawdust caught along the edge of the cut. Most of it was the rich orange-red color he wanted to see, but deep in one corner were several darker patches, softer and almost crumbly when he rubbed them between his gloved fingers. He took out a small flashlight and aimed it into the kerf. He couldn't see more than a few inches. An ancient tree could look completely solid from the outside, while the center had been rotting hollow for decades. Sometimes that kind of core turned a trunk into a giant standing tube, and once the cut disrupted the balance, compression could rip the trunk vertically before the hinge ever had a chance to guide the fall. Boone had watched a man get badly hurt by that exact failure when Boone was 31. Loggers called it a barber chair, a name that sounded almost funny until you saw a trunk split upward faster than a human being could react. Wyatt came closer. "Something wrong?" Boone kept looking into the cut. "Not sure yet." Boone told Tripod to drill another test point into the deadwood on the north side. The bit went in firmly at first, then slowed. There was no obvious large hollow. Tripod gave a small shrug, as if to say Boone's instinct had missed this one. Right then, the radio on Boone's belt crackled. Dispatch at the landing wanted to know whether the crew would finish in time for the afternoon lift window. Boone looked at the rain, then at Wyatt, then back at the king. "Give us another 40 minutes. The other end went silent for a moment. "Boone, Deacon's only got one weather window left. If you miss it, this load moves tomorrow." "I know. Cascadia's asking about production. Tell Cascadia the tree doesn't read a calendar." Boone shut off the radio before the conversation turned into an argument. Tripod picked up the saw again. "If you want to walk away from it, I'll walk." Boone looked up into the crown, disappearing into fog. "We're not walking, but I'm making the final cut." Everybody else backs off farther than usual. Tripod didn't argue. That was what finally got Wyatt's attention. The younger man stopped looking at his watch. Boone checked every member of the crew, made the two chasers move almost 60 feet farther toward the escape route, then used a handsaw to remove one small branch that might catch somebody's boot if they had to run. He kicked sawdust away from the path and looked one more time at the route he would take after finishing the cut. "Escape route clear," he shouted. "Clear," Tripod answered first. Wyatt raised a thumb. Boone lowered the face shield. Rain tapped softly and evenly against his hard hat. He set the saw against the mark, planted his boots firmly in the mud, and took one breath. The king stood motionless above them, so tall that the crown had completely disappeared into the low clouds. "Final cut!" Boone shouted. The engine roared. The chain bit into cedar wood so dark red it was almost purple beneath the bark. The smell of cedar resin rose thick around him, warm and sweet enough that for a moment Boone forgot the cold mud under his boots. He didn't force the saw. He let the chain feed itself through the wood, kept the speed steady, and moved his eyes constantly between the kerf and the hinge. Sawdust streamed out. At first, everything happened exactly the way it had thousands of times before. The wedges started taking pressure. The tree began making small, deep cracking sounds, the normal sound of weight gradually shifting toward the fall line. Tripod stood beyond the danger zone, eyes locked on the upper trunk. Wyatt crouched behind a smaller stump, clearly trying to remember everything Boone had taught him. The two chasers held the lines but didn't pull, waiting for the order. Boone backed the saw out a few inches and checked the hinge. There was still enough wood to hold the direction. He cut farther. The next sound didn't sound like a tree cracking. It sounded like a cannon going off inside the trunk. Boone felt the shock travel through both hands before his mind could even name the danger. A vertical split appeared directly above the cut and raced upward through the trunk. "Run!" he shouted, but his voice was almost swallowed by the sound of tearing wood. The core wasn't solid. It opened into a deep black cavity, a rotten hollow completely hidden behind healthy outer wood. The hinge never had time to guide the tree toward the intended fall line. Compression from behind tore the trunk upward along its length first. Boone dropped the saw and ran for the escape route. A section of the trunk behind him kicked backward. It didn't fall with gravity like a broken branch. It launched away from the stump with the force of a giant spring that had been compressed for hundreds of years, nearly as long as the crew truck and thicker than a man's body. Boone heard Tripod scream his name. He didn't turn around. Something swept past behind him with enough force that the air itself hit his back. Boone slipped in the mud, one knee collapsing beneath him, and rolled left just as the slab of wood slammed into the exact place where he had been standing. The ground kicked up in front of his face. Boone lay face down with mud and cedar resin in his mouth. His ears rang so badly that for several seconds he couldn't hear the saw, the rain, or anyone shouting. There was only a high tone inside his skull. He pushed against the ground and tried to stand, but his right foot slipped again. When the outside world finally came back, it returned with a violent chain of breaking branches overhead. Boone looked up. The king was no longer falling along the cleared route. The trunk had twisted almost a quarter turn on the torn stump, sending the crown away from the safe corridor and toward the east. Smaller trees below were already snapping before the main trunk reached them. Tripod ran across Boone's field of view, shouting for everyone to get clear. Wyatt sprinted toward a rocky rise. The two chasers broke in another direction. Boone had only enough time to see the enormous cedar move through the fog like a wall collapsing across the mountainside. The first impact came from the crown. Dozens of branches shattered at once. Then the main trunk slammed into the slope. The ground jumped beneath Boone's chest. A column of mud, rainwater, ferns, and broken wood erupted higher than a man's head and fell across the whole area. Small rocks rolled over the ground. A young tree tore free at the roots and dropped across the old escape route. Boone curled up and covered his head until the breaking sounds slowly faded. Then everything stopped. At 58, Boone no longer believed in the sense of immortality that many young loggers carried into the woods. Every tree had its own weight, its own lean, and its own hidden weaknesses that sometimes revealed themselves only when it was already too late. He had watched rain make ground disappear under a man's boots, watched dead limbs fall without warning, and seen a snapped cable whip straight through the side of a truck. That was why the silence after the king came down bothered him more than the sound of breaking timber had. Tripod appeared in front of Boone, his face almost white beneath the rain. He grabbed Boone by the shoulder and pulled him upright. "That thing almost killed you." Boone quickly checked his head, neck, ribs, then bent and straightened both legs. There was no sharp pain except in his left knee where it had struck rock. "I'm fine. Fine, hell. Another half step and you'd be under that thing." Boone stood, picked up the saw that had shut itself off, and looked uphill. The king lay completely outside the intended fall line. The stump had twisted apart, revealing a black hollow running deep into the trunk. The main log stretched across a thick patch of ferns, the crew had never entered because it was outside the marked work area. Ferns nearly chest-high had been crushed flat into a broad trail. In the middle of that path, beneath the heaviest section of the trunk, Boone caught a glimpse of gray rock that looked almost like the mouth of a small hollow. Wyatt came closer, breathing hard. "We're stopping, right?" Boone didn't answer immediately. He looked at the rotten core, then at the vertical split running through the trunk. He crouched and picked up a piece of the heartwood. It was soft, black, and crumbled in his hand like soil. Tripod stood beside him. Nobody could have read that from the outside. I suspected something. Suspecting isn't knowing. A bullbucker gets paid to make decisions before he knows. Boone threw the rotten wood into the mud. He ordered everyone to keep their distance, checked each man again, then tried to radio the landing and report the equipment damage and delayed load. The radio gave him nothing but static from their low position. Boone muttered a curse and clipped it back onto his belt. He climbed onto the section of trunk suspended above the ground, using the spikes on his boots to grip the slick bark. From there he could finally see how far the tree had shifted. Instead of lying across the strip they had cleared, the king had fallen over a fern-covered depression and ended near a low rock wall. Several rocks beneath the trunk had been pressed deep into the mud. The gray hollow Boone had noticed earlier sat directly beneath the middle section, where the greatest weight of the tree was pressing down. He moved several yards farther along the trunk. The bark under his boots was cold and slick. Boone crouched, intending to see whether the trunk was resting on rock or only soft ground, when he noticed a patch of ferns higher on the slope moving. It wasn't the wind. The rain was falling straight down. The fern fronds shook violently, then stopped. Boone raised his head. "Tripod," he called, quieter now. "What?" Boone never got the chance to answer. A scream came down from the brush above them. The first note was high and sustained, close enough to a human voice that Boone immediately thought somebody had been hurt. But instead of weakening, the sound grew louder, struck the opposite rock wall, then came back through the trees as though the entire forest were screaming with it. At the end, the pitch dropped into a deep roar that Boone could feel through his chest. Wyatt dropped the steel wedge in his hand. Tripod stood completely still, with both hands resting on the saw. Boone had heard elk, cougars, black bears, wolves, and more injured animal sounds than he could count during more than 30 years in the woods. Nothing sounded like what had just come from that slope. The scream stopped instantly. In the silence that followed, Boone stared up into the fog where the ferns were still trembling slightly. For the first time since the king started falling, he had the feeling that the accident wasn't the most dangerous thing on that mountainside anymore. The scream on the slope had barely faded when a dark object tore through the fog. Boone only had time to tilt his head on instinct. A rock nearly the size of a basketball flew through the opening between two trees, passed over Wyatt's head, and slammed straight into the hood of the crew truck, parked about 160 feet away. Metal caved in with a sharp crack, and a burst of white steam immediately blew from the front of the engine. The whole crew froze. Nobody had time to understand what had just happened before a second rock came down, this one striking the ground beside the chainsaw, lying in the mud and throwing water and sawdust across Boone's pants. Tripod reacted first. He backed away, eyes searching the slope above, and shouted that it was a bear. But even before the words were out, he knew he was wrong. The trees above them erupted with movement too large for black bears and too fast for an animal trying to avoid people. 3 dark figures moved through the forest about 100 feet uphill. They ran on 2 legs, broad-shouldered, with long arms sweeping close to the brush and black-brown hair, soaked flat in patches beneath the rain. Each step flattened ferns and knocked young trees aside. One of the 3 stopped behind a fir trunk, exposing only half a shoulder and part of the head. The other 2 continued moving parallel across the slope, holding almost equal distances, as though they had already divided their positions. Boone didn't have time to study them. A branch as thick as a grown man's arm spun through the air and slammed into the ground directly in front of Wyatt. The young man jerked backward, lost his footing, and fell into the mud. Boone dragged him sideways, while shouting for everyone to get away from the truck. Another rock came almost immediately, punched through the windshield with an explosive crack, and showered the cab with glass. The truck shook. The alarm gave one short howl and stopped. The next rock struck the driver's door and crushed the steel panel inward hard enough to knock the handle out of position. Within seconds, Boone understood that the most frightening part wasn't the strength behind the throws. It was where the rocks were landing. None of them were aimed directly at a person. They struck the truck, equipment, open ground, and spaces only a few feet from the crew. One rock was large enough to kill Wyatt if it had landed 2 steps farther left, yet it hit the engine instead. Another passed over Tripod's head and destroyed the rear glass. The Sasquatch on the slope could thrown directly at them. They weren't doing it. The screaming came again, this time from 2 directions. One deep call came from the west, a higher one from the east, and then a third rolled down from near the place where the cedar had fallen. Boone found himself trapped between a wall of sound and objects flying through the rain. He slid down behind the lower side of the king and used the enormous trunk as cover. Tripod rushed after him, dragging the saw out of the open ground. Wyatt and the 2 chasers took shelter behind a low rock mound. They couldn't use the truck. The windshield was gone, the hood had been crushed, and steam was still pouring from the engine. The only logging road ran along the slope below, but reaching it meant crossing more than 40 yards of exposed ground controlled from above. Between throws, Boone raised his head and watched the trees. A large shape moved behind the trunks. It stopped at the exact moment Boone saw it and nearly disappeared against the wet wood. Its height made it impossible for him to fit any man he knew into the outline. The shoulders were level with branches more than 6 feet above the ground. One arm rose. Boone only saw the final motion before another rock left the hand and came down the slope. He ducked. The rock struck the right side of the truck frame and sent the sound of metal ringing across the mountainside. Wyatt couldn't take it anymore. He burst from cover and ran toward a ravine to the south, where thicker brush offered more concealment. The 2 chasers looked after him and followed. Boone shouted for them to stop, but the rain and the screaming swallowed his voice. Tripod hesitated for less than a second, then went after the other 3, slipping downhill and grabbing tree trunks to keep his balance. Within a few breaths, all of them disappeared into the fog. Boone started to get up and follow them, when a rock struck directly in front of him and blocked the route. He stepped backward on instinct and pressed his back against the cedar trunk. When he looked up again, the entire slope above had disappeared into white fog. He was alone. Boone pulled the radio from his belt. His hands were slick with mud and rain. He pressed the transmit button and forced his voice to stay clear enough that anyone who caught the signal would understand. This was no longer an ordinary logging accident. He called Mayday, reported that the crew was being attacked by unidentified large animals, and said the men had scattered from the area. Thick static answered. He changed channels, tried the landing, then called Deacon Vance on the frequency used for the heavy-lift helicopter. Nobody answered. The rock walls and deep valley were swallowing the signal the same way they always did whenever the crew worked below the ridgeline. Boone clipped the radio back onto his belt and pulled the short axe from his tool rig. He didn't believe the axe would do much against something that had just thrown rocks weighing dozens of pounds from that distance. But holding something familiar felt better than standing there empty-handed. Then the rock throwing stopped. It didn't slow down. There weren't a few final throws. It ended at the same moment from all 3 directions. The sudden silence tightened the skin along the back of Boone's neck. A heavy footstep sounded on the cedar trunk above him. Boone turned. A dark figure appeared higher on the fallen trunk and stepped out of the fog. Boone had seen large bears rear onto two legs. They could stand tall, but they still looked like animals temporarily forcing themselves upright. The Sasquatch in front of him was different. Bigfoot stood naturally erect, both knees slightly bent for balance on the wet wood. The Sasquatch was close to 10 feet tall, with massive shoulders and almost no visible neck beneath black-brown hair. Both arms hung well below the hips. Rain ran through the hair across the chest and arms in narrow streams. The smell reached Boone before he could make out the face clearly. Wet hair, earth, rotting wood, and a sharp animal body odor, like something large that had spent days soaked in the rain. Boone swallowed. His hand tightened around the axe handle until it hurt. The Sasquatch stood still. Boone shouted, partly to threaten him and partly to force himself not to back away. He swung the axe out in front of his body as a warning. His voice sounded embarrassingly small in the forest. Bigfoot didn't answer with a roar. The Sasquatch simply watched him. Through the rain, Boone began to see the face more clearly. A low forehead, heavy brow, broad, flat nose. Darker skin around the eyes, beneath the hair on the cheeks. The eyes sat deep and looked almost black, but they didn't move wildly the way Boone expected from an agitated animal. Bigfoot looked directly at Boone, then at the axe, then back to his face. A bear cornered at this distance usually showed signs before charging. The head lowered, the lips pulled back, weight shifted forward. A cougar often avoided direct eye contact until the instant it attacked. The Sasquatch in front of Boone showed none of the patterns he knew. Bigfoot held every advantage in position, size, and strength, yet didn't close the distance by even one step. Then Boone noticed how quickly the Sasquatch's chest was moving, not with rage. It looked more like someone who had run as hard as possible and was forcing himself to stand still. Boone lowered the axe a few inches. The Sasquatch's posture changed immediately. The shoulders loosened slightly. The response was clear enough that Boone wondered whether Bigfoot was reading his movements the same way Boone was trying to read his. A small cry came from somewhere beyond the fallen trunk, very faint. Boone almost thought the rain had fooled him. The Sasquatch turned his head instantly. The reaction was so fast that Boone looked in the same direction. The sound didn't come again. Bigfoot turned back toward him. Then the Sasquatch bent down, extended one arm, and pointed at the fallen cedar between them. Boone didn't understand. Bigfoot pointed again, this time placing the whole hand against the bark with a heavy slap. Then he raised his head and pointed toward the sky. Boone looked up automatically. There was nothing overhead except gray cloud and treetops moving in the rain. He looked back at the Sasquatch. Bigfoot repeated the exact sequence, first pointing at the tree, then toward the sky. "What do you want?" Boone said quietly, even though he knew the question meant nothing. The Sasquatch lowered himself farther, both arms curved as though wrapping around a large invisible object. Then Bigfoot lifted both hands and extended the body upward, acting out the motion of pulling something off the ground. A sound came from his throat, nothing like the roar that had terrified the crew. It was higher, broken, closer to pain than threat. Boone looked at the cedar, then at the Sasquatch's hands. He began to understand that Bigfoot wasn't pointing to the tree simply because the tree itself was dangerous. The Sasquatch wanted Boone to do something with it. Boone took one step forward, no reaction. He took another. When he reached the king, he looked toward Bigfoot. The Sasquatch shifted to one side, revealing the eastern side of the trunk where the cedar had crushed the ferns. Boone moved along the fallen tree. He remembered the gray opening beneath the trunk that he had seen when he first climbed up to inspect the fall. The first scream had interrupted him before he could look more closely. Now, the Sasquatch was guiding him to that exact spot. The ferns had been crushed into green mud. Boone knelt and pulled them aside with both hands. The cedar rested so low that less than a foot of dark space remained between the wood and the rock below. He lowered his face close to the mud and tried to see inside. Boone pulled the small flashlight from his chest pocket, switched it on, and aimed the beam through the gap. The light struck a low rock wall, then reflected against dark brown hair. He adjusted the angle. A hand lay in the mud. It was much smaller than the hand of the Sasquatch standing behind him, though still larger than Wyatt's. 5 fingers, hair across the back of the hand, dark skin across the palm. The fingers curled slightly as though trying to grip the ground. When the light reached it, the index finger moved. Boone froze. He shifted the flashlight farther to the side. One arm was trapped between rock and part of a broken root. Deeper in the darkness, he could make out the shoulder and side of a smaller Sasquatch lying on one side inside the hollow. The cedar wasn't pressing directly across the whole body. A rock outcrop had held the trunk slightly above the ground, leaving a narrow pocket just large enough to keep the juvenile from being crushed completely. But a secondary section of wood and collapsed earth had pinned the hips and legs. A very weak, rough breath came from the darkness. The adult Sasquatch behind Boone made a low sound. Boone turned. Bigfoot had dropped to his knees several yards away. For the first time, the overwhelming presence of the Sasquatch disappeared. Both shoulders were lowered, his head bent toward the hollow. His hands were open against the mud. Bigfoot made another short, broken sound and looked at Boone. Boone looked uphill. Another dark figure stood behind the trees at some distance. She was shorter than the male in front of him, but still larger than a human. The second Sasquatch didn't approach. She stood completely still, with both hands gripping a small tree. Boone suddenly remembered seeing 3 figures when the rock throwing began. They weren't 3 predators. They were a family. The realization came quickly, but everything fit. The first scream had come immediately after the king fell. The rocks destroyed the truck and equipment without killing anyone. The Sasquatch kept the crew contained, forced them away from the area. Then, after everyone ran, the male approached the only person who remained. Bigfoot didn't attack Boone. He pointed at the tree, pointed at the sky, acted out the motion of lifting. Boone looked back at the smaller hand, moving weakly in the mud. The entire ambush suddenly meant something different. They hadn't been trying to kill the logging crew. They had been trying to make the humans stop long enough to look underneath the tree. Boone crawled closer and aimed the flashlight deeper through the opening. He couldn't fully assess the injuries, but the juvenile was still breathing and reacting. The problem was the weight above. The king weighed many tons. 20 men with pry bars couldn't lift it. Cutting directly into the loaded section of the trunk could cause it to roll or collapse and kill the juvenile instantly. The small hydraulic jack in the truck might create only a few inches of clearance and would be dangerously unstable in the mud. Boone stood and looked along the full length of the cedar. The male Sasquatch rose too and watched him. Boone pointed at the trunk, spread both hands apart, and shook his head. He had no idea whether Bigfoot understood the gesture of refusal. The Sasquatch's face tightened. Boone immediately pointed toward the sky, remembering Bigfoot's earlier motion. The helicopter. Deacon Vance and the heavy-lift logging helicopter were the only thing for miles that could raise a cedar this size without bringing road equipment down the slope. Boone looked at the radio clipped to his belt. From where he stood, the signal was still dead. He would have to climb toward the ridgeline to make contact. A distant engine came through the rain. Boone turned toward the logging road. At first he thought it was equipment from the landing. Several seconds later, the sound grew louder. A truck was climbing back up the muddy road below. The male Sasquatch heard it too. His entire body tightened immediately. The other large figure behind the trees moved as well. Boone looked toward the sound, then at the small hand inside the hollow. Through the engine noise, he heard an unmistakable metallic sound. A rifle action being worked. Tripod and the others were coming back. This time they had guns. Boone stood motionless for several more seconds, after hearing the metallic clicks drifting up from the logging road below. The sound was far too familiar to a man who had spent more than 30 years working beside people who considered a hunting rifle standard equipment in a truck cab. Tripod and the others were coming back, but this time they weren't returning with saws, cable, or toolboxes. Boone looked at the large male Sasquatch, then at the dark gap beneath the king. The small hand was still moving weakly in the mud. Everything ahead suddenly reduced itself to one cold equation. If his crew reached them before the helicopter, somebody might fire. If the helicopter didn't come, the juvenile could die from pressure, cold, or internal injuries. And if Boone couldn't get a signal right now, none of the rest would matter. He pulled the radio from his belt, held it up in front of the male, then pointed toward the sky. Boone had no idea whether the Sasquatch understood the device or only recognized the direction of his gesture, but he kept going. He used both hands to act out something large being lifted from the ground, then pointed toward the cedar and repeated the motion. The male watched closely, his eyes never leaving Boone's hands. What happened next sent an uneasy feeling through Boone. The Sasquatch lowered his head once, slowly and deliberately. It wasn't the repetitive, unconscious bobbing of an animal examining an object. It was one short movement that came exactly when Boone stopped explaining. Boone refused to read too much into it. He had lived long enough to know people often saw intelligence wherever they wanted to find it. But he couldn't deny the response in front of him either. He pointed uphill toward a rocky shelf above the main tree line. If he could reach it, the radio might clear the terrain blocking the signal. Boone started climbing. The male didn't stop him. After several seconds, the Sasquatch began moving parallel to him, about 25 feet away, always keeping himself between Boone and the hollow where the juvenile was trapped. The climb was difficult even in dry weather. Now the slope had become a slick mix of mud, roots, and loose rock. Boone grabbed young firs for support and drove the toes of his boots into firmer patches of ground to keep from sliding backward. Every few dozen steps he tried the radio again. Only static answered. The male moved far more lightly than his size should have allowed. Instead of crushing brush, he chose rocky humps, root shelves, and open patches of earth, sometimes stopping before Boone even noticed unstable ground ahead. Once, Boone stepped onto a moss-covered patch that looked solid. The Sasquatch immediately made a short, low sound. Boone stopped. Less than a second later, the edge of the ground collapsed almost 2 feet, sending loose stones tumbling into the fog. Boone changed direction without saying anything. The caution between the two species was still there, but it had taken on a different shape. He was no longer thinking about whether the Sasquatch might charge him without warning. What mattered now was time. Every minute spent climbing was another minute the juvenile remained beneath tens of tons of cedar. Every time the wind shifted, Boone thought he heard the weak moan from below, though he couldn't tell whether it was real or his mind replaying the sound. After nearly 10 minutes, Boone reached a rocky shelf where the trees thinned. He pressed the radio button. Static still filled the channel, but a broken voice appeared underneath it. Boone turned, moved another 10 feet toward the edge of the rock, and called again. This time he heard his own name more clearly. Deacon Vance was on the other end, asking about the crew's condition and why the emergency channel had been opened. Boone looked down the slope. The male stood several steps below, his head raised. Rain ran over the dark face, and his eyes moved between Boone and the radio. For a moment, Boone felt trapped between two systems that had no way to speak to each other. One was the human world, where every lift required dispatch approval, procedures, liability, insurance, and accident reports. The other was represented by a Sasquatch that no official form had a box for. If Boone told Deacon the truth, that a juvenile Sasquatch was trapped under the cedar, Deacon might assume Boone had suffered a head injury. The company might halt the flight and call supervisors, rangers, or law enforcement. People would ask for coordinates. establish a safety perimeter, and investigate before allowing a multi-million-dollar helicopter into fog. The juvenile below didn't have that kind of time. Boone pressed the transmit button and said a badly injured person was trapped beneath the tree and needed an emergency lift immediately. The lie came out faster than he expected. No preparation, no hesitation. He simply replaced a Sasquatch with a human being and kept the rest of the truth intact. A life was pinned beneath the cedar. Human strength couldn't free it. If they delayed, it could die. Deacon went silent for several seconds. Boone knew the pilot was thinking about weather, fuel, load weight, and visibility limits. Deacon was former military and had flown helicopters into places other pilots would turn away from. But he wasn't reckless. When his voice returned, it was short and controlled. He asked for coordinates, ground conditions, wind direction near the slope, and confirmation that the victim couldn't be moved. Boone answered each question with what he knew. When Deacon finally said he was lifting off immediately and would approach from the west to avoid the turbulent air in the valley, Boone realized he had been holding his breath. He lowered the radio. Relief lasted only a moment before something heavier replaced it. Boone had never liked lying on the job. A small error in load weight, pull angle, or ground condition could cost somebody else. A man's reputation in logging was built by reporting exactly what he saw, even when the truth slowed production. Now Boone had just deceived a colleague who was about to put both an aircraft and his own life into bad weather. But when Boone looked down at the king lying across the rock hollow, he couldn't see another choice. The male was still watching the radio. Boone raised both hands and spread all 10 fingers, then pointed toward the sky. He didn't know whether the Sasquatch understood numbers or the concept of minutes. The male looked at Boone's hands, then at the sky, then turned toward the hollow. After that, he started downhill. Boone followed. Part of him wanted to believe the Sasquatch understood that help was coming. The more cautious part of him simply noted that the male's behavior changed immediately after the call. Halfway down the slope, another engine sounded from the direction of the logging road. It wasn't the helicopter. The rhythm was lower and steadier, sometimes disappearing behind turns before coming back louder. A truck. Fog hung in bands between the trees, making distances look shorter and sounds seem closer than they really were. Boone stopped to listen. Between the engine noises came dry metallic impacts against the truck body. He didn't have to see it to know tripod was bringing the others back. Boone moved faster toward the hollow. On the way, he passed the damaged crew truck from earlier. The hood was still deeply dented. The steam had mostly stopped, but coolant ran in a thin line beneath the engine. Boone yanked on the rear tool compartment. The hinge had jammed from the impact and took 2 hard hits with his shoulder before it opened. Inside were tow lines, wooden cribbing blocks, a pair of small hydraulic jacks, pry bars, an old first aid kit, and equipment intended more for mechanical breakdowns than saving a life. Boone pulled out both jacks, checked the valves, and tucked the first aid kit under one arm. When he returned to the cedar, the second adult Sasquatch had come out from behind the trees. Boone recognized her as female without relying on any single obvious biological feature. She was shorter than the male but still far taller than a person, with a narrower build and black-brown hair plastered against her shoulders and arms by the rain. She knelt beside the rock hollow, almost pressing herself flat to the ground to see into the gap. Small, steady sounds came from her throat in repeating intervals. They didn't resemble mating calls, warnings, or threats Boone had heard from wildlife. The purpose seemed clear. She was maintaining contact with the juvenile trapped inside. Every time a weak moan came from beneath the cedar, the female answered immediately. She didn't try to force herself into the opening, perhaps understanding that any violent movement near the loaded trunk could bring more earth down. Boone set the hydraulic jacks on the ground as quietly as he could. The female snapped her head toward him. Her entire body tightened, one hand planted in the mud. The male stepped between them, but didn't growl. Boone stopped, opened both hands, then pointed to the jacks, the cedar, and acted out a very small lifting motion. He chose a position beside the rock outcrop that was already holding the main trunk off the ground. His goal wasn't to lift the king. The small jacks had no chance of doing that. Boone only wanted to create a little extra support and place more blocking under the load in case the mud continued settling while they waited for the helicopter. He used a pry bar to clear loose rocks, found a surface firm enough to take pressure, then positioned the first jack beneath the lower edge of the trunk. Every movement was slow, because he knew a shift of only a few inches could transfer force directly into the hollow. The male stood close and watched. The female remained beside the opening, but her eyes kept moving toward Boone's hands. He pumped the jack once. The metal made a dull click. Both Sasquatch flinched slightly. Boone stopped and waited. No aggressive response came. He pumped again. The jack head pressed against the wood, and the trunk gave the smallest tremor. A moan came from inside the hollow. The female answered with a higher sound, but still didn't rush forward. Boone stopped immediately, checked the clearance, then moved the second jack toward firmer rock so the load could be spread between 2 points. He took hardwood cribbing from the tool bag and slid it into the tiny opening the jacks created. Rain ran down his hands and made the jack handles slippery. Boone wiped his gloves against his pants again and again. Every time the cedar moved even a fraction of an inch, he stopped to listen. No rock cracked. Nothing changed suddenly inside the hollow. After nearly 10 minutes, Boone had created enough support to wedge 2 solid blocks between the trunk and the rock outcrop. They couldn't free the juvenile, but if the mud sank farther, the blocking might keep the cedar from dropping immediately. The female stared at one of the jacks for a long time. Then she extended one finger, touched the bright metal lightly, and pulled her hand back. Boone couldn't tell whether it was curiosity or inspection, but the motion reminded him of what on his first day, learning to use felling wedges, studying the tool with suspicion before understanding where the force came from. Boone continued securing the cribbing without staring directly at her, not wanting the attention to feel like a challenge. He opened the first aid kit. Inside were bandages, antiseptic, a thin emergency blanket, and a handful of basic supplies. None of it would help if the juvenile had serious fractures or internal injuries. Boone pulled out the thermal blanket, rolled it tightly, then used the handle of his axe to push it through the narrow opening, trying to get it close to the juvenile's shoulder without disturbing the trapped areas. The smaller hand moved slightly when the blanket reached it. The female lowered her face toward the opening and began making the steady sounds again. Boone sat back on his heels. For the first time since the accident, he had several seconds to look at all 3 members of the family together. The juvenile was trapped beneath the cedar. The female remained beside the opening. The male stood farther out like a living wall between his family and the rest of the forest. Boone thought about the rocks, the screams, and the destroyed truck. If their purpose had been to kill the logging crew, everyone could have been dead. Instead, the Sasquatch had kept their distance, struck equipment, forced the men away, and kept Boone behind. That level of control unsettled him in a completely different way from the fear he'd felt at the beginning. Boone leaned down to check the jack valves again and quietly said he wouldn't let the tree drop any farther. He didn't wait for a response. The promise was more for himself than anyone else. In Boone's work, promises usually involved things he could control, such as cuts, cable, or where people stood. This time he was making one in a situation where nearly every important variable was outside his hands. The truck below was getting louder. The male turned his head a moment before Boone did. His shoulders rose, his head lowered slightly, and both hands changed from open to tightly closed. The female also stopped making sounds for several seconds and pulled closer to the hollow. Boone stood. Through rain and fog, a yellow beam swept across the trees below, disappeared, then appeared again. The truck was climbing through the last turn on the logging road. Boone checked his watch. Deacon couldn't possibly be there yet. The weather could make the flight even longer. Tripod, on the other hand, was only minutes away. Boone picked up his axe, but this time it wasn't because of the Sasquatch. He clipped the radio back to his belt, checked both hydraulic jacks, then started toward the road. The male watched him, his body still rigid. Boone pointed toward the hollow and held one palm outward as if telling him to stay there. He had no idea whether the Sasquatch understood the instruction, but the male didn't follow. The headlights continued, cutting through the fog, closer every time they appeared. The engine strained as the tires fought their way up the muddy grade. Beneath the noise, Boone heard something clear enough that he couldn't convince himself he was mistaken. The metallic action of a rifle. The male Sasquatch rose to his full height beside the king, his entire body facing the road. The hair across his shoulders lifted beneath the rain. The female pressed herself closer to the rock hollow. Boone understood that if his crew came into view with rifles already raised, all the restraint that had kept this confrontation from becoming a massacre could disappear with one gunshot. He started running toward the road. Boone ran down the logging road with rain slashing across his face, his boots sliding on mud-covered gravel. The narrowest section was less than 200 yards from the king, with a rock wall on one side and a steep drop into deep forest on the other. If Tripod got past that point, Boone would have nowhere left to stop the truck without pushing everyone into a direct confrontation with the Sasquatch family. He ran until his lungs burned, then planted himself in the middle of the road and tried to catch his breath. The engine below was close enough now that he could hear the tires spinning in the mud. A yellow beam swept through the fog, disappeared, then appeared again even closer. The pickup burst out of the rain too fast. Tripod hit the brakes when he saw Boone standing in the road. The rear tires slid sideways, throwing mud against the rock wall, and the truck fishtailed before stopping only a few yards from him. Wyatt sat in the passenger seat, his face drained white, a large-caliber hunting rifle pointed through the partially lowered window. The two chasers were behind the cab, one holding another rifle and the other clutching a box of ammunition. Boone didn't need anybody to explain what had happened on the drive back. They had spent that time convincing themselves they were returning to deal with dangerous animals, not to find out what had actually happened. Tripod opened the door and stepped out first. Rain streamed from the brim of his hat. His hands were shaking, but his voice was loud and fast as he repeated that 3 massive animals had surrounded them, thrown rocks at the truck, and could have killed any of them if they wanted. Fear had hardened into anger on the veteran logger's face. He wanted to go straight back up the slope and find them before they found the crew again. Boone didn't argue for long. The moment Wyatt unconsciously raised the rifle toward the forest, Boone stepped over, grabbed the barrel near the muzzle, and forced it down until it pointed into the mud. Wyatt didn't resist. He only stared at Boone, with eyes still stretched wide from panic. Boone pointed at his own clothes, then at his arms, chest, and head. There were no claw marks, no blood, no evidence that anything had attacked him directly. The rocks had destroyed the truck without hitting a person. Any Sasquatch strong enough to throw objects that heavy from high on the slope could have killed the entire crew if that had been the goal. Boone told them, as simply as he could, that the king had fallen across a rock hollow and trapped a juvenile underneath. Everything that happened afterward had been the family's way of forcing the humans to stop, leave the immediate area, and pay attention to what was beneath the tree. Tripod laughed, but there was nothing amused in the sound. He looked at Boone as though the cedar had hit him in the head after all. The two chasers behind the truck exchanged glances. Wyatt kept the rifle pointed down. Boone didn't demand that they believe the word Sasquatch. He only described what they could verify for themselves. The rocks had missed human bodies. The adult male had approached without attacking. He had pointed at the fallen tree, and a smaller hand was still moving beneath the rock hollow. The heavy lift helicopter was already on the way. The only thing they needed to do now was keep a rescue from turning into a shooting. Tripod stepped closer, anger mixing with disappointment. He had followed Boone through some of the worst logging seasons either of them had ever seen and trusted Boone's judgment through landslides, snapped cables, and trees that changed direction. But this was beyond anything their experience had prepared them for. Tripod pointed toward the destroyed truck and reminded Boone that if one rock had landed only a few feet differently, Wyatt would be dead. Boone didn't deny it. That was exactly why they had to think before anybody pulled a trigger. A Sasquatch that could throw with that kind of accuracy and still avoid killing anyone was either unbelievably lucky or knew exactly what he was doing. Rain drummed harder against the roof of the truck. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Boone heard the engine idling, the faint ticking of cold metal, and somewhere up the slope, one very low note that appeared and disappeared almost immediately. Wyatt raised his head first. Tripod turned toward the trees. The two chasers tightened their grips on the rifles. The male Sasquatch stepped out of the fog. He appeared on the higher section of road, about 100 feet away, directly where the truck's headlights reached through the rain. There was no roar and no charge. Bigfoot simply walked out from between the trees and stood upright in the open, tall enough that his head nearly reached the lowest branches behind him. Black-brown hair, soaked with rain, clung to his shoulders and chest and made the shape of his body even more obvious. His long arms hung at his sides, both hands open. Yellow-white light reflected from the dark face, and the eyes fixed on the men below. Wyatt froze. Boone could feel the rifle barrel trembling beneath the young man's hand. Tripod stopped laughing. Everything they had seen during the confusion of the rock attack had been movement between trees, fog, and rain. Now the Sasquatch stood completely exposed, impossible to mistake for a bear, a man in a costume, or anything else familiar. His size was frightening, but what Boone noticed more was the calm. Bigfoot didn't crouch, as if preparing to charge. He didn't bare his teeth or beat his chest. He simply stood there like a living boundary between the road and the hollow behind him. Boone released Wyatt's rifle barrel, but kept his hand close. He told the crew that if the male wanted to attack, their current distance wouldn't save anybody. A rifle might wound him, but the first shot could also send the female charging out, or make the entire family react in a way none of them could control. The only thing keeping the situation quiet was that nobody had acted out of fear yet. Tripod looked at Boone, then back at the Sasquatch. Years in the woods had taught him what animals looked like in the seconds before they attacked. He didn't see it now. The doubt remained, but something more uncomfortable was beginning to replace it. The possibility that Boone was right. Wyatt slowly moved his finger away from the trigger. The two chasers behind the cab lowered their barrels as well. Boone used the opening. He ordered Tripod to turn the truck around, take everyone back to the landing, and wait there. Nobody was to return until Boone called, and nobody was to mention Bigfoot or Sasquatch if a company representative, ranger, or sheriff showed up. They only needed to say the tree had fallen off course. There was an active rescue situation, and the site remained unsafe. Boone knew the request sounded insane, but one panicked call could bring armed people and cameras into the forest before the juvenile was even free. Tripod hated retreating. Boone could see it in the way his jaw tightened. But Tripod also understood the command structure of a logging crew. When a site became dangerous, the bullbucker decided who stayed and who left. Boone's 30 years didn't make him infallible, but they were enough for everyone to know he didn't give orders because he panicked. Finally, Tripod returned to the driver's seat. The two chasers placed their rifles on the truck floor. Wyatt stayed seated, his eyes still fixed on the adult male. Before Boone closed the door, Wyatt looked at him and quietly asked whether the Sasquatch was intelligent. Boone didn't look at Wyatt. He looked uphill. The male remained exactly where he had been, almost as though he were waiting to see what the humans would choose. Boone said that, right now, Bigfoot was behaving more intelligently than they were. Wyatt swallowed and pulled the door shut. Tripod shifted into reverse. The truck slowly backed down the narrow road, its tires carving 2 deep tracks through the mud. Nobody raised a rifle. Nobody opened a door. When the pickup disappeared around the bend, the headlights swept away from the Sasquatch and vanished into the fog. The engine gradually faded until Boone could hear only rain and water running down the rock wall. Boone stood alone in the road with the adult male. The distance between them no longer felt like a confrontation. Boone turned and started back toward the rock hollow. After several steps, he heard heavy footsteps behind him. The Sasquatch followed, but didn't crowd him. When Boone looked back, the male lowered his head once. The gesture lasted only a moment. Boone didn't know whether it was gratitude or an accidental movement, and he didn't try to decide. He just kept walking. The rain began changing when they reached the clearing. Soft drops turned to small pellets of ice that clicked against Boone's hard hat and the bark of the king. The temperature was falling quickly as wind came down from the ridgeline. Cold cut through Boone's clothing, even though he was still hot from running. The female Sasquatch knelt beside the hollow, her back and shoulders trembling in small waves. She was still making low sounds toward the dark opening, but the pauses between them had grown longer. Boone dropped to his knees and checked the 2 hydraulic jacks. One had sunk several millimeters deeper into the soft ground. The wooden cribbing remained in place, but the mud around the base of the jack was turning loose. Boone used the pry bar to remove wet soil, placed a wider block beneath the jack to spread the load, then pumped it again in short strokes. The cedar only needed to settle a little farther to crush the remaining space beneath it. Boone didn't dare lift harder. His only goal was to preserve the gap until the helicopter arrived. A weak breath came from underneath. Boone lowered himself into the mud and shone the flashlight through the opening. The juvenile's hand still rested near the edge of the rock, but it moved more slowly now. The beam reached a wet, fur-covered shoulder. Boone couldn't see heavy bleeding, but that didn't reassure him. Crush injuries could cause severe internal damage with almost nothing visible from the outside. The juvenile had also been lying there in cold rain for far too long. Boone unzipped his rain jacket. Cold immediately cut through the sweater underneath as he pulled the heavy waterproof layer off. He rolled it into a narrow bundle and used the axe handle to push it through the opening, trying to spread the material across the juvenile's shoulder and chest without disturbing the trapped areas. It was clumsy work and probably offered only limited protection. But at least the jacket could stop some of the cold water running from the cedar directly onto the body below. The female watched every movement. When the last edge of the jacket disappeared into the opening, she lowered her face closer and made another series of quiet sounds. Boone looked at the female more carefully. Earlier, her size had made him think only about strength. Now he could see the hair on her arms trembling constantly from cold and exhaustion. She had stayed beside the hollow since the tree fell, one shoulder and hip covered in mud, from repeatedly lowering herself to the ground to reach the juvenile. Boone took out the remaining emergency blanket and unfolded it. When he moved closer, the female stiffened. Boone stopped, placed the blanket on the ground, and backed away. After several seconds, she touched the silver material, pulled part of it toward the opening, and used it to shield the area where water continued dripping near the juvenile. Boone left her alone and returned to the jack. He checked the cribbing again. A quiet knock came from the wood as the load settled. Boone stopped instantly. The adult male stood at the edge of the clearing with his head turned toward the sky. His body was nearly motionless, but whenever the wind rose, he changed the direction of his gaze. Then Boone heard the sound he had been waiting for. At first, it was only a low vibration that could have been mistaken for wind passing through the valley. Then it repeated with a steadier rhythm. Helicopter blades. Boone jumped to his feet and pulled the radio from his belt. The signal remained full of interference at their lower elevation, but Deacon's voice occasionally broke through. He was approaching the coordinates slowly because of the low cloud ceiling and turbulent air rolling back from the mountainside. Boone looked up. There was nothing above him except a white-gray ceiling of fog sitting low over the treetops. The rotor noise grew louder, then weakened as the helicopter circled from the west. Fir tops began shaking under the distant rotor wash. Rainwater and ice dropped from the canopy in waves. The female pressed closer to the hollow. The male backed away from the open area but kept his eyes on the sky. Deacon called for Boone to confirm the position. Boone answered, but the transmission broke apart. Deacon couldn't see the fallen cedar, couldn't see anybody on the ground, and couldn't descend without a clear reference point. In heli logging, a pilot needed coordinates, a ground worker, and direct visual reference before lowering a hook. Fog this thick turned even a few dozen yards into blind space. Boone ran toward the edge of the clearing and waved both arms even though he knew it was useless. The helicopter was close enough, now that he could feel the vibration inside his chest, but the aircraft remained completely hidden. A dark shape briefly appeared inside the cloud, then vanished again. Deacon made another pass. Through the radio, Boone heard him say he couldn't hold position for long in the turbulent air without a visual marker. Boone looked around. His dark clothes, the brown cedar, black mud, and green forest all disappeared into the fog. Then he remembered the emergency equipment on his belt. Every crew working with helicopters carried handheld flares for lost communications and marking ground positions in bad weather. Boone pulled out the flare tube. His fingers had gone so numb that he slipped off the activation cap the first time. The helicopter noise began moving away again. Boone pulled the glove from his right hand with his teeth, gripped the flare, and tore the cap free. A sharp hiss followed. Brilliant red light erupted in front of him, so intense that the fog around his body turned into a glowing wall, the color of blood. Boone raised the flare over his head, ran into the middle of the clearing, and swung it in broad circles. Above him, the rotor sound changed direction. The fog began rolling in huge spirals. Tree crowns bent beneath the air pressure. A massive shape slowly emerged through the white, first the dark underside, then the body of the heavy-lift helicopter as it descended. The machine came out of the cloud like a steel ghost, its rotors carving water vapor into violent twisting streams. Boone held the red flare high, his eyes burning from smoke and wind, while the helicopter finally found them in the middle of the forest. Boone kept the flare above his head until the rotor wash drove the red smoke sideways across the slope. The logging helicopter hovered inside the fog, its body moving slightly in the turbulent air. Boone ran toward the long line, caught it when the end dropped to shoulder height, and dragged it toward the fallen cedar. Behind him, the Sasquatch family remained positioned around the hollow. Boone worked by instinct built over decades. He wrapped the choker around the portion of the trunk above the load-bearing point, staying away from rotten wood and sections that could break apart under tension. He checked the cable connection twice, tested the direction of pull, then radioed Deacon to hold position. One bad attachment point could make the base of the cedar rotate directly into the hollow. There was no truly safe option anymore, only one that was less dangerous than the others. Boone moved away from the trunk, gave the signal, and pressed the radio button. Deacon slowly increased lift. The cable tightened and began vibrating like an enormous instrument string. A deep groan came from inside the king's rotten core. Mud around the trunk darted back cracking. Boone watched the space beneath the hollow and saw the opening widen by several inches. Then the base rotated downward. The movement was so slight at first that Boone was the only one who noticed it. The crown lifted before the heavier base, causing the trunk to rotate on its axis. One of the hydraulics below tilted at a dangerous angle. A mass of mud slid away from the edge of the hollow. Boone screamed for Deacon to stop and threw both arms up. Deacon immediately reduced the load, but momentum had already carried the cedar farther. The trunk settled with one deep impact that shook the ground. A cry from beneath the hollow cut through the rotor noise. The female rushed to the opening and released a rapid series of high sounds. Boone dropped beside her and checked underneath. The juvenile's hand was still moving, but more weakly than before. Boone understood they had nearly used up their entire margin for error. Deacon's voice came over the radio, tense but controlled. The cedar's center of gravity was too far toward the base. If he continued lifting, the lighter crown would rise first, while the heavy end rotated down exactly where the hollow was located. To raise the trunk evenly, they needed counterweight near the crown. Boone looked along the cedar. The crown rested at an angle on higher ground. There was no machinery, no heavy equipment, and none of his crew remained beside him. The adult male looked at Boone, then at the tree. When the juvenile moaned again, the Sasquatch moved. He ran directly into the rotor wash. Boone raised one hand instinctively to stop him, but the male had already climbed onto the king. He used both hands and feet to grip the trunk and moved quickly toward the lighter crown. Wind from the helicopter flattened the hair across his shoulders and body. Bigfoot looked at Boone once, then pressed his entire body down against the upper section of the cedar. Boone understood before Deacon could even ask over the radio. The Sasquatch was becoming the counterweight. Boone ran out of the danger zone, pressed the transmit button, and shouted for Deacon to begin lifting again, very slowly. There was a pause on the other end. Boone didn't explain. He only repeated that the load now had counterweight and told him to lift. Deacon trusted him. The cable tightened for a second time. The cedar shook hard, but this time it didn't immediately rotate. The male pressed his chest into the trunk and locked both legs around the remaining branch stubs. Boone stood beyond the hazard radius with his eyes fixed on the base. Mud beneath the trunk split apart and black water poured into the gap. The heavy end began rising without rolling downward. Boone signaled for slightly more lift. The king came off the ground. Mud clinging to the underside fell in heavy sheets like black rain. The male stayed pressed against the crown, his body shaking with the load. The opening beneath the trunk widened from a few inches to almost 2 feet. The female didn't wait for Boone to signal. The instant the space became large enough, she moved into the hollow. One arm reached under the juvenile's shoulders, while the other pulled at the hips buried in the mud. The young Sasquatch made a weak cry, his body limp and heavy from exhaustion. Boone rushed close enough to help clear a section of broken root wrapped around one leg. The female pulled one final time, and the juvenile slid free from the darkness. The young Sasquatch was alive. His hair was dark brown and covered in mud from head to foot. One leg remained pulled up at an unnatural angle, and a dark bruise showed beneath thinner hair across one shoulder, but his chest continued rising and falling. The female pulled him tightly against her body, backed quickly away from the suspended trunk, and sat beside a fir tree. She held the juvenile's head against her neck with both hands, and made a continuous series of short sounds. The juvenile answered with a rough cry, but it was stronger than before. Boone radioed that the hollow was clear, and told Deacon to move the load toward open ground on the far side. Deacon carried the cedar several more yards before reducing lift. The male remained on the crown. When the king came low enough, the Sasquatch jumped from the trunk, landed on both hands and feet in the mud, rolled once, then stood almost immediately. The cedar settled onto the ground with one deep, heavy sound. This time, nobody was underneath it. Boone remained still for several seconds, staring at the empty hollow they had just exposed. His entire body began shaking as the adrenaline drained away. His knees weakened. He dropped into the mud, braced one hand against the ground, and tried to breathe. Cold rain mixed with sweat along his temples. Above him, the helicopter still held position, its rotors tearing the fog into white ribbons. The adult male walked toward the female and juvenile. He bent down and placed one enormous hand on the younger Sasquatch's head. The juvenile opened his eyes for a moment. A sound came from the male's throat, so low it was nearly lost beneath the aircraft. Then he stood and looked up at the helicopter. He raised both arms. There was no roar and no pounding of the chest, just two long arms lifted toward the aircraft, hovering above them. Boone watched the gesture and couldn't think of a more accurate word for it than triumph. Deacon had to be seeing it from the cockpit as well. The radio remained silent for an unusually long time. Finally, Deacon asked whether the ground situation was secure. Boone said it was. Deacon didn't ask what the Sasquatch was or where the injured person Boone had reported had gone. He only confirmed that he was leaving the valley before the fog closed back in. The helicopter slowly gained altitude. The rotor wash weakened. Leaves and mud stopped spinning through the air. The sound of the aircraft moved west, disappearing into cloud for seconds at a time, until eventually only a distant echo remained between the mountainsides. The silence that returned was completely different from the one before. Nobody was running. No rocks were flying. No cedar threatened to collapse. Boone slowly stood. He looked at the family in front of him, and for the first time, felt no need to keep one hand near his axe. The female was still holding the juvenile. The young Sasquatch was more awake now, one hand gripping the hair across his mother's chest. The adult male stood beside them, breathing heavily after his climb onto the cedar. A long streak of mud covered him from shoulder to hip. He watched Boone for a long moment, then stepped toward him. Boone didn't move back. The distance closed to only a few yards. The Sasquatch reached into the tangled hair across his chest and searched through it as though looking for something he had been carrying. When the enormous hand opened, a small gray-brown object rested in the center of his palm. Boone held out his hand and took it. The object was heavier than it looked. It had the shape of a tightly closed pine cone, but the entire thing had turned to stone, every scale preserving its shape as though it had been cast and hardened. Rain made the surface shine almost like marble. Boone rotated it in his hand and felt the fine grooves running around each scale. He had seen petrified wood and plant fossils before, but never an intact fossilized cone like this. The male didn't wait for a reaction. He turned back toward his family. The female lifted the juvenile and held him close against one hip. The three Sasquatch started walking uphill into the fog. The juvenile looked back once, but the male never did. One by one, they disappeared between the trees, as though the forest were swallowing each figure. Boone stood alone with the fossilized pine cone resting in his palm. He looked at the king lying several dozen yards away. That morning, the cedar had been a valuable load of timber, a production target, a problem of fall direction and market value. Now it looked like the evidence of a mistake no accident report could fully describe. Boone had always known that old-growth trees provided hollows for birds, small animals, and countless other forms of life. He had heard those arguments throughout his career. But knowledge printed on paper was different from seeing a family standing in the rain, because one cut from his saw had destroyed their shelter. Tripod and the rest of the crew had been waiting at the landing for almost 2 hours when Boone finally appeared. He told them only that the juvenile had been freed, the family had left, and nobody was to return to that section of forest that day. Tripod looked at the fossilized object in Boone's hand, but didn't ask about it. Wyatt was quieter too, nothing like the young man who had spent that morning checking his watch and waiting for the shift to end. The report sent to Cascadia Timber stated that the king had suffered from internal heart rot, fallen outside the planned direction, and created an emergency rescue situation. Boone also documented that the area was unsafe for continued logging because the ground had become unstable. Every part of that was true. He didn't write about the rock hollow, the flying stones, the 3 Sasquatch, or the adult male clinging to the cedar beneath the helicopter. Deacon didn't ask questions either. 3 days later, Boone met him at the aircraft yard. The 2 men looked at each other longer than usual. Boone had already prepared an answer, in case Deacon asked about the injured person who had never existed, but the question never came. Deacon only said the helicopter's belly camera had suffered heavy interference from the weather that day, and that the footage wasn't clear enough to include in the operational report. Boone simply nodded. Boone went back to work for another 6 weeks. He still arrived on time, checked the saws, studied the wind, and took his place as bullbucker, just as he always had. But every time he put a hand against the bark of an old cedar, he found himself looking longer into the dark spaces between its roots. The sound of a saw biting into wood began bringing back the noise from beneath that rock hollow. For the first time in more than 30 years, Boone no longer saw a standing tree as one isolated piece of timber. He saw the ground beneath it, the hidden cavities, the paths animals used, and all the parts of the forest that would disappear at the same moment the tree came down. In early February, Boone turned in his resignation. Cascadia Timber offered to move him into a safety supervisor position where he wouldn't have to run a saw as often. Boone declined. Tripod told him to at least wait until winter was over. Boone refused that too. At nearly 60 years old, he didn't pretend one afternoon had suddenly turned him into an environmental activist. He only knew he could no longer stand in front of another old-growth tree, mark the fall direction, and act as though he had never seen what might be living underneath it. That spring, Boone began volunteering with a local conservation group that surveyed trails, restored stream corridors, and marked old-growth areas that needed protection from disturbance. The work paid far less than logging. Some days he did nothing more than pull invasive plants or repair fencing around restoration sites. But for the first time in decades, Boone could walk through the forest without calculating how much lumber each tree might produce. The fossilized pine cone remained on the mantel in Boone's small house. He never took it to a museum or geology lab for testing, partly because he didn't want to answer questions about where it had come from, but also because its value to Boone had nothing to do with its geological age. It was the only thing he carried out of that forest that day that he didn't have to hide inside a report. Months later, while conducting a volunteer patrol near the edge of one of the remaining old-growth cedar stands, Boone stopped when he found a cluster of branches arranged on the ground. They had been placed in 2 straight lines that met in a V, the point aimed deep into the unlogged forest. Boone stood there for a long time. He didn't take a photograph, record coordinates, or call anyone else to come see it. He simply backed away from that route and continued his patrol in another direction. Boone Hartley never picked up a logging saw again. Through an intermediary, he once said the fossilized pine cone was still sitting on his mantel, and that every time he looked at it, he remembered the adult male standing beneath the helicopter in the rain. Boone called him Old Growth, not because he knew the Sasquatch's real name, but because it was the closest thing he had for a being so large, so quiet, and seemingly more a part of that forest than any human who had ever walked into it. What stays with me most about Boone's story isn't the moment Old Growth became the counterweight on that fallen cedar. It's the fact that a man who had spent more than 30 years cutting trees changed the way he saw the forest after realizing that a tree is never just a tree. When one comes down, what disappears with it may never show up on a production sheet, a logging map, or a financial report. This is a fictional story inspired by Sasquatch folklore and the long tradition of reports about large unknown beings in the forests of the American Northwest. But the question behind it is real. How much do we actually know about what lives in the places we change, And how often do we recognize the value of a place only after we've already taken too much of it away? If you had been in Boone's position that day, would you have called the helicopter to save a being the rest of the world doesn't even officially recognize as existing, or would you have walked away to protect yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. In the next story, we will leave the Olympic Mountains to follow another Bigfoot witness. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.